Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. And I'm actually coming to you from not the studio, and not even the country, actually. I'm in Bermuda with family, and if you're catching the video version of that, that's what you're seeing in the background. So I'm recording this because I've been away and thinking a lot about the Acolyte and everything that's been discussed around the Acolyte, all the issues that it seems to be bringing up. And today I wanted to talk about the Jedi, and considering the fact or the possibility that they might be the bad guys in some fashion in this series. I haven't seen episode 4. I'm recording this before I get to see that. I'm not going to get to see it for a few days, actually. But just in thinking about the events of the first 3 episodes so far, and how it definitely doesn't necessarily cast the Jedi in a very good light, it sort of raises the question of whether the Jedi are actually the bad guys. And I think that's like from a certain point of view kind of situation here, right? I mean, on the one hand, you have the Coven of Witches that just want to be left alone, but on the other hand, there is some kind of implication that there are dark side machinations happening within that coven, or at least if you wanted to look at it and put it on a spectrum of light side versus dark side, that maybe it would lean to the dark side. And of course, we have all the other indications of dark side activity going on with that stranger with the red blade walking around, and whether he or she or they have something to do with all of this, still yet to be seen. But really, this is about the Jedi and how they are behaving as an institution. So when we hear Obi-Wan Kenobi talk about how for 1,000 generations the Jedi were the guardians of peace and justice in the galaxy, yeah, that's all well and good, but institutions over time kind of get, kind of scope creep, if you will, right? Like whatever the mission was for an organization, sometimes if it goes on for long enough, it goes beyond what the bounds of what it was initially intended to do, and that's not always a good thing. And thinking about the Jedi at the time of the Acolyte, there hasn't really been, as far as we know, a challenge to their power from a force-wielding perspective for quite a long time. Certainly there was a challenge to their power posed by the Path of the Open Hand in the long 300s BBY, and then again by the Nile in the 200s BBY. And apparently it's left them not wholly intact. I mean, according to Master Soul, right in the beginning of the Acolyte, he talks about how their political enemies, the Jedi's political enemies, might take advantage of this situation of an unknown assassin killing Jedi, and if it turns out that it was actually somebody who had been previously a Jedi, it could be problematic for the Jedi Order. And yet the Jedi are so powerful and are backed by the Republic, at least as this moment, that when the conversation comes up about May and Oshi being tested and possibly being found force sensitive, the mothers of this coven acknowledge that there's nothing that they can do to prevent the Jedi from taking the girls away from them. And from the parental perspective of things, that's really tough. And actually the situation with May and Oshi really kind of frames both sides of the conversation with that. On the one hand, wanting the best for your child and knowing that they could possibly get it outside of the realm in which they're being raised. And so if Oshi wants to go and can possibly be trained further, then wanting the child to be able to pursue that opportunity. But on the other hand, wanting to protect your own child, not wanting to let your child go outside of your own customs and rituals and civilization and society. And that's what the situation with May reflects. I think ultimately where it gets thorny is the idea that the Jedi aren't really making this a choice. Like if they test force sensitive, then they are going to be taken away. It doesn't matter that Oshi wants to go. It matters that the Jedi are going to bring her regardless. That's where it comes down to the issue of Mother Anastasia talking about it not being about good or bad, it being about power and who's allowed to use it, even if you consider the possibility that the witches of Brendok are actually bad. Like, even if you thought that, then it still doesn't negate the point that the Jedi are deciding that they are the only people who should be wielding Force-related powers in the universe, and are the only people who should be training people to be using Force powers in the universe. And so somebody has to say, okay, well, who decided that? And is that the right decision? And what oversight do the Jedi have to make sure that they are doing right by the galaxy? And at this point in time, it doesn't sound like they necessarily do, or if they do, it's not a benevolent and non-partisan situation. It's actually a politically charged one. So ultimately, I go back to that line from The Dark Knight, right, that Harvey Dent says, well, either you die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. It really does seem like we are getting another piece of the puzzle that George Lucas started building in the prequel trilogy, where we get to see the Jedi increasingly shown as having lived long enough to become the villains, at least in some people's eyes, certainly in Anakin's eyes, and very probably in the eyes of a lot of people across the galaxy. Barriss Offee certainly saw it that way when she decided to bomb the Jedi Temple, which itself was not really a great idea, but the fact that she had a point, that the Jedi had become had gone beyond the bounds of what they were supposed to be doing, and had become basically, warlike, and they were not the guardians of peace and justice. They were instead field commanders in battle. It was an entirely different thing. It was another mission scope creep from what the Jedi were supposed to be. So yeah, villains, maybe not ultimately, but certainly vulnerable and able to be manipulated, and with people out there mad enough about the Jedi and what they're doing, and committed enough over the long term to be able to manipulate them so that way their mission goes sideways, they do become the villains in the story, or at least can be categorized as villains in a very convincing narrative. That seems to be what we're seeing here. And they're not necessarily the villains in the Acolyte, but their behavior is certainly indicating that they are becoming increasingly compromised over time. And that's what I've got for you for this episode of the podcast. I would love to know what you think. Chime in on YouTube if you've seen it there. The comments are right there. On Spotify at the Q&A section. Anywhere else, head to the blog post for this show's episode at sw7x7.com and let me know what you think. And that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. If you enjoy the show, then please tell other folks that this exists for them. You can do that with ratings and reviews and comments and likes and follows, and just tell people. That's very helpful too. And you can even help me produce this show on a daily basis, and you can learn more about that at patreon.com/sw7x7. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode, as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.